How was it going, NPC Nation? Welcome back to a brand new video. This video is going to be called What If Spiro Agnew Never Resigned? So, a lot of people don't know who Spiro Agnew is, or any vice president that's not the first 5 vice presidents, because they all became president. But after that, no one really knows who the vice president was. But Spiro Agnew is the one out of 2 vice presidents to resign. The first one was Andrew Jackson's vice president, John C. You can search him up if you didn't know who he was. But there's only been 2 vice presidents that resigned in office. Spiro Agnew was the second one to do so. No other vice presidents have resigned. But the reason I'm talking about him, because he was Nixon's vice president. He did not resign because of the Watergate incident. He resigned because of his own crimes that he committed. He committed, I think, some tax stuff, if I'm correct. I forgot the main reasoning. I think it was some tax stuff and some money. It was some money stuff. Some crimes committing money. I don't think it was a bribery. I think it was just tax stuff. I really do, if I remember correctly. I forgot what he resigned for, but I know it wasn't for Watergate. I almost said Whitewater. That's Bill Clinton's real estate scam. But Watergate was Nixon's reason that he resigned and appointed Gerald Ford. The reasoning is because of the line of succession. I think a year prior, Spiro Agnew, or months prior, Spiro Agnew, the vice president at the time, Nixon's vice president, resigned. Gerald Ford was never really Nixon's vice president. He became the president, one of only a few people to become president without being elected. The only, I think, person to become president not being vice president was Gerald Ford. He was never elected to be president, and he was never elected vice president. A lot of people don't know that Gerald Ford was never Richard Nixon's vice president. Spiro Agnew was. Well, let's say what if of history. I love doing history videos. It's one thing I love doing on this channel. You're going to see a lot. Sometimes you're going to see some history videos. Not a lot, but you're going to see some history videos. But Spiro Agnew, a lot of people don't know who he is, like I said, because he's vice president. Vice presidents weren't really important until you get the first 5, because they all became president. John Adams became president, and he was the first vice president and became second president of the United States. But Spiro Agnew was Richard Nixon's vice president. Let's say Spiro Agnew never resigned. Well, Richard Nixon resigns. Spiro Agnew never resigns and becomes the next president of the United States of America. He becomes the 38th president of the United States of America instead of Gerald Ford. And another person that was president that was never elected president, he eventually won a second term, was trying to think. Teddy Roosevelt was vice president. He was elected vice president. There's only been one person that was never elected vice president, and that was Gerald Ford. But back to the topic on hand. Spiro Agnew becomes the 38th president of the United States instead of Gerald Ford. This is one of 2 things can happen. We're still out of this is after Vietnam. We're out of Vietnam because this is the 70s. We're out of Vietnam. Spiro Agnew is now president because this is 1972. Well, investigation's going to happen no matter what, because they investigated him for his crimes either way. And now they're going to do a further investigation because now he's president of the United States. His term is a little shaky and a little corrupt, just like Richard Nixon's. Eventually, I think Spiro Agnew would get investigated by the House for and they were trying to impeachment papers of Spiro Agnew, and that's the reason Richard Nixon resigned the presidency, because he was going to get impeached if he didn't. Well, Spiro Agnew does not resign the presidency, and eventually they go through an impeachment investigation, and the House eventually impeaches him. And then the Senate eventually, goes to the Senate. They see his crimes weren't as bad as Richard Nixon's reasons of his crimes. His crimes were legit political. They'd be like, oh, just pay it off. If you just use the rest of your presidential, paycheck, all your presidential paycheck will go towards that money that you owe. And then you don't have to resign. They don't impeach him out of office, but he gets impeached through the House, and he becomes the second president to be impeached through the House, instead of, what we have now. Clinton and Trump would become the third and fourth, instead of the second. Spiro Agnew would be impeached through the House, but the Senate's like, we're not going to impeach him, he can just pay it off, or we don't see that his crimes were not that bad. And he eventually goes on, doesn't run for re-election, finishes off the 72, the 76, those 4 years, doesn't run, but then we still would get, as 39th President of the United States, I think we would probably still get Jimmy Carter to be the next President of the United States, instead of Gerald Ford. I think Spiro Agnew would still pardon Nixon. That would be the first thing he did. That's one thing people hate Gerald Ford for. The first thing he did was pardon Nixon. Spiro Agnew was never pardoned for his crimes. His crimes weren't as, he wasn't a big front runner of the Republican Party during the time of Nixon. I think Nixon chose can't speak, NPC Nation. He chose Spiro Agnew, I think, because I think he's from the South. Most people choose their opponent, their, vice presidents based on morals or where they're from. He wasn't a big name in the party during the Republican Party in the 70s, or in the late 60s. Spiro Agnew is like a mysterious guy. He's a weird vice president, really. But he did resign for his crimes. Only 2 people to do that, and they haven't done that since, Andrew Jackson was vice president at the time, John C. But Spiro Agnew, it's hard to determine what his presidency would be about, because it would be, he'd be impeached out of office by the House and Senate. That's another timeline. The first timeline is he's just impeached by the House, and then, Clinton and Trump gets impeached, all that stuff. I think we would still have a President Trump and President Clinton. It's hard to determine, because Spiro Agnew is not an exciting voice. I heard one of his speeches before I made this video. It wasn't very exciting. One of the speeches he made about, news bias. They're always going to be biased. The news are going to be biased towards one party or the other. It's always been like that. And he doesn't seem like that very exciting. So it's hard to determine if he does have a full 4 years as president, or does he get impeached out of office. The first timeline that I'm going to look at is he doesn't get impeached for his crimes. They do find him guilty eventually. He just pays it off of his check. No impeachment papers are filed to the House, and they just let him go for his 4 years. He's not going to run. He's not going to run for another term, because he is the people the United States citizens doesn't want another criminal. They just had Nixon resign, and they see that he's shady, like he's like a modern day Warren, yeah, and modern day Warren G. Harding. He's gonna be very corrupt and very corruptible person, like Warren G. Harding was, very scandalous. So they don't want another scandalous. So he decides not to run, or they pick another candidate. They will pick Gerald Ford because he is a very high, party member and very spokative party member. Plus, Spiro Agnew seems like a boring president. He had a boring term, a boring 4 years, and they don't want him in the party. They don't want another criminal. They just had to deal with Nixon, being a crook, all that stuff. Him saying he's not a crook, not accepting his mistakes, all that stuff. So Spiro Agnew does not run for another 4 terms. This is the first timeline. He doesn't run for another 4 terms. Another term, not 4 terms. I'm kind of tired. Another term. He doesn't run for another term. He only runs for the rest of the 4 years, from 72 to 76, and then leaves. Because when he left and when he resigned his vice presidentship, he leaves and doesn't really run for any more office anyways. He goes into basically hiding, and he goes into solitude and stuff like that. Seems like a boring person, very private person, paranoid person. I think he would do the same thing if he became president. I don't think he would resign. I think he would finish out the 4 years in the second term of Nixon. I think he would finish out those 4 years, leave office, and be secluded like always. The second timeline is he's impeached, out of office. It's boring. I know he seems like a boring vice president, because he kind of was a boring vice president. If you do research on him, I listened to him talk about bias in the news. The news will always be biased. Talk about bias for the Nixon administration, because they're not going to like him. He came from a great president prior to him, which was Eisenhower. He just came from Eisenhower, and then, Eisenhower was a great Republican president. He not even just Republican, just a great president term, a great 8 years Eisenhower, and getting us out of the Korean War, trying to get us out of the Vietnam War, all that stuff. And then you have Kennedy with the Civil Rights Movement, and, LBJ, the Civil Rights Movement during that time. And then you go back into kind of the Warren G. Harding Republicans, where they're kind of sketchy. And then that's the thing with Spiro Agnew. I think he would run the next 4 years, finish out Nixon's term, and then I think we would still get a Jimmy Carter presidency, because Spiro Agnew took that crookedness of the crooked Republicans like Warren G. Harding and kept that in the 20th century. He brought that like a couple years later. It's still in the 20th century, but brought that in the 70s, and then in the 20s, you had Warren G. Harding and his corruption. He wasn't president for long. Eventually, Spiro Agnew would run, finish off his term. We would get some things that Nixon wanted done. We would still be out of Vietnam. We would get some more accomplishments from the Nixon administration that Nixon wanted done before he resigned. And then Gerald Ford would run still, like he does, against Carter. But this time he wasn't president. He wasn't a sitting president. But Spiro Agnew, even though he was corrupted, and he had his criminal past as well, did not resign, and became president, would tarnish the reputation of Gerald Ford. Because Gerald Ford was the next person basically in line for the presidency if if Spiro Agnew did resign, which he did in real life. Gerald Ford never became vice president, but became president the day Nixon resigned. Well, like I said, Agnew doesn't do that, and it brings a stain, basically, on Gerald Ford's campaign. He's still going to run. He doesn't win. He doesn't win at all. He doesn't even become president in this timeline, I don't think. But then, I think, we have Reagan. Reagan brings that hopefulness back to the party. And that's basically the timeline. I know this video is kind of boring, but hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, press the share button, press the like button, press the red shiny subscribe button, press the bell so you're notified every time I upload a video, and see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.